Today, I'm going to talk about the nuts and bolts of canine searches and how it plays out. So, as we get going with this, I want you to give you a roadmap of where we're going to go through the presentation today. First off, we got to realize that we're going to borrow from ICS. We're going to go ahead and use some concepts that every police officer in the country should be trained on because that's one of the standards the federal government has put on us. The incident command system, we all think it's a big thing that we had to go. We had to get our ISO 700s or whatever it is to, for qualification on it. But the reality is it's actually uh, borrowed from how we actually do our work anyway. But the beauty of it is strength of its structure. And so we're going to borrow from that. I'm going to talk about roles and who does what during the search and why having those roles and a division of labor is critical for a canine handler because you've only got one job. There's only one thing you're supposed to do. And if you can focus on that one job, everything goes better. And de-escalation is all the rage right now. And it has come to the forefront over the past 2 years in particular after the George Floyd protests like that. But it's been on the radar screen for years before that, and it is working its way into general law enforcement. And yes, you can actually de-escalate in canine deployment. So we'll talk about the exact way you go about it. And when you do that, everything moves more smoothly. And if you can figure out how to get everybody being within their roles and being prepared to de-escalate when the time comes, you can come up with the kind of solution you want, because we all know the safest arrest you can make is one where you generate compliance. So our goal at the outset should always be to generate compliance. No matter how long you search, no matter where you go, if you can generate someone walking out and giving up, life gets better for everybody. Everybody gets home safe and sound. And that's what we're looking for. If you have to use force and you know that you've done what you could to try and generate compliance, you're going to be viewed much more favorably by the courts and by the courts of public opinion. So without any further ado, let's dive into the content. Here we go. So why we're talking about ICS. The incident command system has been developed as a universal framework for handling major events. It works pretty well for small events because you can still use some of the defined and designated roles that you have in ICS. And it's pretty simple. And we'll talk some more about those roles and who does what. But if everybody stays in their lane, things go smoothly. Just like when you're going down the highway, it gets a little dicey when people start wandering out of their lane. We don't want that. But if everybody can stay in their lane and follow their role, everything goes much better. And once you get through this and you realize that there is an incident commander at a scene, and there are special resources that have special tasks that are used there, and that there are support resources that do other things involved in a canine search. Once you get those three things figured out, the rest of it all falls in place. And one of the other things you have to realize too is you have a place to start. And it actually can be as simple as like saying that car right there, their command post. But there are some other things that go with that. Having some place where everybody knows that's the rally point, that's where we're going to talk, and there's a safe access route to it, is incredibly valuable. The beauty of ICS is that it's scalable. Yes, it's designed, and the way it's taught to us is like for major catastrophic events, but you can dial it down to what you need to get through a search smoothly if you try. So it's really important to think about the scalability of that system and how you're going to use it. Because once you get this thing scaled down to what you need for the size of operation you're working on, because canine searches can be small or they can be big. Once you get that, you find out that this structure is ideal for canine operations. There isn't almost anything you can't do with it as long as you are principle driven. Don't try and follow a cookbook or a recipe. Get a few principles under your belt and everything will go a lot better. So the next thing we have to talk about in the roles is the primary officer. The primary officer is the de facto incident commander. That person that either is the primary officer that got there first or was the senior officer when a group of officers arrived together should be the incident commander. And that person should establish the command post and say, this is where we're starting. This is how this is going to fan out from here. Their job is to go ahead and make sure the containment is established. If you're a canine officer, you owe your success to containment. Containment officers are critical to this, and way too many police departments don't spend the time to teach containment to their officers, particularly containment for canine operations, because it's a little different. and when you're dealing with some static operations. That primary officer should also identify resources that are needed and then request them. They're the one that's going to say, we need a dog at this location. Now, if you're a good canine handler, if you're the kind of person that I would want working with me, we're going to listen to the radio. We're going to hear it. We're going to be headed that way anyway. We won't jump into the call until we're asked, but we will point ourselves in that direction. So we're ready to respond in a timely manner. But in case they are on another frequency, they didn't hear or whatever, that request has got to go out so the canine team can get out there and do their job. And then once they get there, their job is to coordinate the event. Once that primary, that incident commander takes charge of that thing, they own it. They stay there. They can delegate certain sub roles within the incident command structure, but they can't abdicate. Somebody else can come and take over of a higher rank or if needed, but whatever, there's got to be some way that the transfer of ownership of that call is clearly identified. It's important that your incident commander is not the canine officer. And I know this is tough because canine officers tend to be very focused and driven individuals who want to go out there and find that bad guy. They want to take the lead and take charge. But when you do that while you're trying to manage the resource of the dog, things can get out of hand. And really, the canine officer's role should just be to watch that dog and apply their dog the way they're trained. That primary officer can take charge of this. And I would tell a little story about why this works out so well. The officer and dog depicted in this were involved in a violent domestic violence situation. The suspect had assaulted his spouse, and he was known to have firearms, but wasn't known whether he was armed or not. A track was started from the scene, and the track led some blocks away to a residential construction site. The dog started to go into the residential construction site in through the open stud walls of the structure. The handler, who had gone through a briefing with cover officers, who knew what was going on, had informed radio as they were proceeding where they were headed. All of this was being handled. He had two cover officers with him. Those two cover officers that were running with him were on either side of him. And as they rounded the corner, one of the cover officers saw that as the dog was going in, there was a suspect. He called out and says, I see him. The dog was stopped. The handler stopped the dog short of making contact with the suspect to try and challenge him out. Suspect dropped to his knees as ordered, put his hands over his head. And as he started to go up with his one hand, the other hand went into his jacket. He pulled out a gun and he shot the dog. Then the gun came up and it was pointed at the officers. They returned fire. Suspect was shot at the scene, died. Officers all survived. Dog survived. So that dog was a knucklehead, literally. And the bullet hit him at the top of the head, skidded along the outside of his skull and out through the back. And he was okay and went back to finish out his career. And the reason I want to tell you this story is this case right here would have been very different had I been doing it back in the days when I was a county deputy. There were plenty of times that I would run a track and I would lose my cover officers. I was stupid. I was young. I was eager, and I was faster than I've never been accused of being really fast, but I was fast enough that I would lose cover officers going through the pucker brush out in the county where I was working. And I would have encountered that person by myself. But these officers had learned from mistakes from the past and knew that they had to stay together as a team when looking for this guy. And it was because they were together as a team, they were able to engage him, offer him the opportunity to surrender. The guy didn't want to take it. That's his choice. He initiated fire and he brought that gun up on those officers and he paid a price for it. The point of bringing this up to you is that's a very different outcome than I would have had in my young and dumb days. And I think we've come farther as an industry to understand the importance of contact and cover and making sure that we proceed with unified tactics. And as a result, these officers came out of this. This event happened in the early 2000s, and we've come farther since then. So it's really important that we think about how we're doing these things. Even if you look at this, these officers did everything right. They had established their tactical plan before they proceeded. They kept everybody informed where they're going. They challenged that suspect. The gunfight ensued, and they came out of it okay. And ideally, the perfect outcome would have been that guy would have given up. but he didn't make that choice. But because they had their act together, they came out of it in good shape. And that's what we want to talk about. Now, this case was made possible because they had containment. This guy ran into that house to hide because he saw he couldn't get any farther than where he wanted to go, because containment officers had established that a boundary that kept him from going by. And containment's really important when it comes to canine cases. I think it's fair to say that, particularly in agencies that do tracking or agencies that do area searches and building searches, that most arrests with the dog result from containment. And if the suspect isn't giving up to a containment officer, that suspect is probably going to go to ground because they don't want to run past containment. Sometimes they do, but a lot of times there's a lot of psychological pressure on them to go to ground. And when they go to ground and they're stationary, guess what? They become a scent source that starts to build up at that point and actually makes it easier for your dog to find them. So one of the ways you put this psychological pressure on these people is to keep your emergency lights on. I actually will occasionally take my PA and I'll turn to external radio, and I'll let the radio sound blare out over the PA, because even if they can't see the lights, they hear that and they wonder what's going on. And if different officers at different times are doing this around containment, they never know where everybody is. But it's really critical that you stay in one spot, remain in your car, and you get yourself set up in a way that you see the maximum. And when I talk about diagonally opposite corners here, what I mean is, if you get there and you have a crime scene, and you're obviously going to have the primary officer and his or her cover officers in front of that, but the containment officers, when they're available, should respond to diagonally opposite corners. So if you have one officer here, diagonally opposite of where the scene is, that officer can see along two axes. The next officer coming in should go to the diagonally opposite corner from that. And that way they have a box built around. And it's better that you start wide and then tighten up than try to get in close to the scene, because most of the time suspects are well past where we set up our containment because of the delay it takes someone making the call, 911 centers, processing it, getting officers en route. And it's amazing. Even I can cover a city block in under a minute. So if you have a 5-minute delay, I can get 5 blocks away. So it's really important that you set this thing up first. So what do we do then? If we have resources available, then we bring them in the next diagonally opposite corners. And that means putting someone up here inside that first perimeter and the next one after that. Now what you have are these overlapping perimeters where you can literally create a miniature grid where you can see where this person is. These people, if they stay stable, they get high ground, they get on corners, they can do that. Now, this depiction is ideal representation. It's not the way it really works out, because we live in a world that has curves and hills and valleys, and you're going to do the best you can. It's not perfect, but the more visible you are, the more audible you are, the more pressure you put on that person to stay in one place. And we played with this back in the 1990s, where we actually played essentially a game of capture the flag. We had a suspect start, a quarry officer who's playing the role of a suspect, start at a location, and he had a pretty tough slog up a hill, then through an open space on an old decommissioned military installation. And if you can get to this point without being detected, you win, we buy you dinner. If you can't get by, that's okay. You're not going to have to buy dinner, but we get good information for training our dogs. So they were motivated to get there. And what we found was that if these officers started breaking their discipline and they started moving, it was easier for those officers simulating the suspect actions to get to that point and get their free dinner. So it's really important to exercise discipline and containment, and to train your containment officers and to help them think about it and set this up in your head. On your way to the call, you should mentally log where these people are and set it up and get it rolling. Containment is one of those critical rules for canine searches that you got to have, and you got to have it done well. Now, you as the canine officer are going to go through this process, and you have to remember that once you get there, you only have one thing to do. Your one job is to go ahead and deploy that dog as you're trained and focus on it. To do that, you're going to have to be briefed by the primary officer. You take a briefing with them. They have to give you the information that's going to tell you the things that you need to know. You have to make sure that this is an appropriate canine deployment, because it's not. If this isn't the kind of thing that you should be deploying your dog on, it's going to look bad for everybody. I know that different agencies and different communities have different standards about what they want, but the deployment rules that you have should be clearly spelled out in your policy. And if you're not, talk to your command and get that stuff really clearly defined. Once you understand whether it is or isn't an appropriate canine deployment, then you can go ahead and proceed. And remember, resist the urge to become the incident command. Don't take over that role. Stick to your lane, let them stick to theirs. You also shouldn't be the leader of the search. Now, don't get me wrong. We know that if, for example, if you're tracking, your dog is going to be out in front of you and you're going to be pulling that team along the route to get to that person. That puts you in the position of point. That is different than being the team leader. Don't confuse the two. The point is the person who goes up front, who's trying to read the lay of the land, or in this particular case, read the dog and the lay of the land to make sure that you're on the right track to getting where you need to be to find that person. The team leader's job is to make sure that everybody stays in their roles and does their job, that as we come into other environmental factors that need to be taken into account, you make adjustments. Scott Sargent had a quote where he said, stepping out of the canine handler role can lead to deviation from the search plan because your juggling roles as the team leader, the arresting officer, the cover officer, and all those things. The odds are this will lead to reduced control of the dog. You don't want that. Maximum control of our dog is going to be what we need to have when we're deploying, looking for a suspect. And the more you divide your attention with other roles, the less focus you have on your dog, and your dog will pick up on that. They are very astute readers of their handler's behavior. When they know that you're distracted by other things, oh, good, I'll handle the rest of this. You go handle all that other stuff that doesn't matter to me. I'm going to go find this guy. And then we might run into problems. So it's very important. Stay in your role. And as you go through this process, you've got to support the other officers that are with you on this thing. And those cover officers are going to run with you, and they're going to do a lot of important things. I strongly recommend that if you have enough officers with you, I realize I'm talking to an audience that may be like I was with a county deputy, with me and one other deputy covering an entire county for a swing shift. Or it may be agencies that have municipal agencies with plenty of resources. If you have it available, one of those cover officers should be dedicated solely to you. Their job is to watch the environment where you and your dog are. They're not to watch the dog. They're to watch the environment around you, scanning for threats, scanning for opportunities, and taking advantage of that stuff. There should be a team leader, one person that at least makes the call. Now, he or she don't have enough officers to create a full team. That team leader could be one of the cover officers, whether it's left guard, right guard, or rear guard, it doesn't matter. But that team leader is the one everybody acknowledges is making the calls. Once you have those roles fully established, then you can go ahead and decide who else is going to form the arrest team. Because remember, we've got the only tool of police inventory that will drag us 5 blocks through the city from the local stop and rob to where that bad guy is hiding behind somebody's house underneath their back deck. You're going to need an arrest team there. You as a handler should not be part of that arrest team. Your job has ended at that point. You've gotten them to the suspect. Keep your dog there. Keep scanning the environment for threats or accomplices or anything else you need to deal with, but let the cover officers decide who among them is going to be the arrest team. If you have to go hands-on with a suspect while you're trying to control your dog, things can get pretty bad. I know that many of our certifications involve a search and a pat down, then you have to handle the suspect. But if you have cover officers there whose hands are otherwise occupied and don't have a dog to deal with, let them do that. That search exercise is really just a demonstration of control that's possible. It is not necessarily something you should do on a regular basis, especially if you have the resources available at the end of the search, which you truly need. It's important to remember that as we go through this process, you're going to go through this thing, and these are pretty complex pieces. There are a lot of moving parts in this canine search. And the only way you're going to be getting this all together and working properly is to have a proper pre-deployment briefing. That means the search team is assembled, the information that they need is gathered and disseminated among them. They all confirm that they know it. Everybody in that pre-deployment briefing should acknowledge, I understand this. And that means, doesn't mean just nod your head. It means maybe repeating it back, paraphrasing or something like that. All that active listening stuff that they tell you in there plays a role in this. And it's important. And we'll talk about it later, why you got to have that. And you also have to know exactly who is doing what, who's left guard, who's right guard, who's going to be dedicated cover for the canine handler, who's going to go ahead and be the rear guard or alternate responsibilities, swinging and looking for rear guard as you proceed on this. Because we all know that our dogs can take us along a route where a suspect could double back to the downwind side and we won't know it, that we passed that person up and now they have our back. And we want to make sure that we have somebody watching that back. And that's why having a rear guard, somebody who's responsible for checking to the rear, making sure that we're not getting ambushed, is a critical role. Doesn't matter if it's a building search, area search, a track, that is absolutely essential. Then the other thing you have to realize is this is going to happen. And if you have engagement with a suspect and that dog encounters a suspect and that person begins to assault the dog, either because the dog's been sent in as a tool of force, or gets the drop on the dog, what do you do? I think that it's probably safe to say that for all states, the dog doesn't have the same right of protection that a human being. We can use lethal force to protect a human being that's being assaulted, but dogs are not human beings and the courts don't recognize them as such. And we run into trouble if we think that we can use deadly force to do this. So your pre-deployment briefing should always include a reminder to those cover officers that if the dog is assaulted, we cannot use deadly force to defend the dog. We're going to have to stand by and come up with something else. There are other less lethal tools available. There are other things we can do, but realize that's the legal situation that we face right now. And those officers need to know this going in, because if they don't, they may get themselves in trouble for applying deadly force on a suspect of assaulting a dog. And we don't want that to happen. We want everybody to come out of this with their physical and professional health intact. And once you get these things there, you refine them until everybody concurs, everybody's in agreement. This is the tactical plan. This is the way we go. Tactical planning before you start is the way you keep yourself out of trouble. Remember, PPPP, proper planning prevents poor performance. And if we plan and we operate according to that plan, we have to realize the plan is there as a framework. And there's a saying in the military that battle plans only survive first contact with the enemy. Police tactical plans only survive first contact with the suspect, and you're going to have to adapt and adjust. But if you have a starting framework and you have defined rules, it's far easier to do that adjustment that everybody else all of a sudden deciding, I'm going to do this thing. And next thing you have a gaggle of officers in a swarm on somebody, and all of a sudden their tactics are out the window, left themselves vulnerable to an ambush from an accomplice on the outside, or maybe there's more being deployed on that person than they need. So really important, get it there, get it all under concurrence, and then document it. Now, when I'm talking about documenting, there's a lot of things to consider. The best way to document it is on body worn video. If your agency doesn't have body worn video, maybe you have in-car video, get it at least on audio from the in-car video. So in other words, do this within earshot of a microphone that you're issued by the department. If you don't have that, then fine. Document it on paper. That means you have to go in depth explaining to people, all right, what's the charge? If we find this person, canine officer, you should ask that officer in charge, that prime officer, if I bring this person back to you, what are you going to charge him with? If you're coming into this thinking that it's going to be a felony domestic violence, the guys actually know it's just a misdemeanor. Okay, that may change it in your jurisdiction. Or if you're thinking you're going for a robbery, says actually it was a shoplift and just brushed the clerk on the way out. No, not now. You have a theft with a minor assault. It's not really a robbery, at least in our agency, it wouldn't be. You have to make sure that canine warnings, they understand that they have to stop and give canine warnings, and that the content of the canine warning has to be clear. It has to say who you are, that the dog is going to be deployed, that the dog can bite them if found, and you have to give them an opportunity to comply. And those 4 components have to be in every warning. Who you are. This is the police with a police dog. Police dog will bite you. Come out now, or make your presence known to the nearest officer. Those 4 components have to be in there, and you got to make sure that you cover them. Document the start point. Particularly if it's a track, where are we starting this track? And how do we know that start point is not so stale or contaminated that it needs to be beyond the dog's ability to follow? Then you also have to see, where are we going in relation to a building search? Are we entering from the point of entry where we found a broken door or broken window? Or do we have another way to get in that maybe is a little safer, a little better? We want a safe entry point. We also want a safe access route to our command post. So that stuff has to be and documented. Make sure your description of the suspect is in your documentation, whether it's in writing, on video, it doesn't matter. That description has to be sufficient that you can really say that when you find that person, that's what you're looking for, as best you have. Also, anything about the suspect behavior that should give officers concern. Was that person violent? Were they acting in a way that makes you think they might be in a bit of a mental health or emotional or substance abuse crisis? If so, that's going to change your deployment rules. So you're going to have to talk to your agency about how that goes. But that stuff should be in there. Any weapons that person is known to have, but they don't know whether they have them with them or not. That person's history of using weapons, you have that information. Access to improvised weapons along the route should be thought about too. You're going to have to form this up. If you, for example, you're tracking along and you think this person's unarmed and you trap past a woodshed and you find an axe sheath laying there, but with no axe, somebody had better tell the rest of the team that. That's important information. You should also document anything about hazards. If, for example, it's a building search and say, hey, this is a chemical factory. They have chemical spills on the ground. You may want to get booties for your dog at that point. You may decide the dog's not an appropriate tool to deploy there because they're really vulnerable to chemical toxicity on their pads. And it's really important that we make sure that we aren't operating our dogs and putting them at needless risk. Anything that's relevant, that should be documented. So ideally you get it on your body worn video. Next best is going to be on in-car video, the audio. And then the final thing is write it down. And by the way, if you have these things on body worn or in-car video, you should probably write them down anyway. Make sure that you're getting the information you need, because as you get done with this process, okay, you're going to wade into the search. And as you wade into the search, everybody stays on their rules. And before you start that search, you're going to go ahead and give another canine warning. What does it hurt for you to do this? If you think that by not giving a warning, you could sneak up on somebody, no. That team moving through there makes enough noise, they're going to know somebody's coming. You might as well give that warning, put more psychological pressure on them to give up, see if you can generate compliance. And if nothing else, everybody knows you tried. Reissue the warning as you go along. There are a lot of triggers for when those warnings should be given. If you change your environment, things like that. I'll issue multiple warnings before that search starts. We get going. Also, before you start, talk to the team and confirm that everybody's body worn video and radios are working. Also, if you're working with an outside agency, once you establish which way is north, everybody has a better chance of being able to give good information to radio about the search progress. If any known hazards, again, confirm. We know that we got this coming up. This guy had a traffic collision over here, stacked it up. There's broken glass all over the place. The car skidded over this. He ran that way, but then he ran back over the accident scene on the way out. So we're going to have to go traverse that broken glass or anything else that might be. Broken glass from a burglary entry, things like that. Okay. Also, go over the dog assaulted procedures beforehand. If that dog's assaulted, make a decision. Who's going to try to apply a taser? Who's going to apply pepper spray? You can apply pepper spray on a suspect, and it's not going to affect the dog the same way it does the human being because they don't have lacrimal glands to work the same way we do. And so you can probably give yourself a bit of an advantage that way. But think about what those dog assault procedures are going to be. Once everybody's got all that, confirm. Everybody ready to go? All right, roll and you start your search. Now, the search process, again, I say in this, you stay in your rules. Handler, resist the urge to get out of your role and dedicated cover. It's really hard for the dedicated cover officers, if they don't do it often, to focus on really being the eyes and ears for that canine officer. The eyes and ears on the environment for the canine officers whose eyes and ears are on the dog. This is a really critical role, and you got to find, if you get a chance to pick who's going to have that role when you start your search, you probably should. Even if it's just somebody, maybe they're not the most high speed, low drag tactical officer there, but there's somebody that is steady and you have good communication with them. Okay, great. Because last thing you want is to try and tell somebody, hey, man, I need you to focus with me. Or have somebody who's afraid to tell you to grab a hold of you by the collar to tell you to slow down, outrunning your team. You need to have somebody you can trust. And make sure that as you go through the search, you stay within your training tactics. I'm lucky. I worked for an agency that had a uniform process to searching buildings. I called it MOBS, multiple officer building search. 3 officer minimum. We had a particular set of algorithms for flow about how we would flow through space and clear them. Everybody in the department knew it. If you handle a call, you could do this. That goes out the window when you go to another agency that maybe does a little bit differently. And so you got to find out where the trade tactics are, where the deviations are as best you can before you start the search. But whatever you do, stay within those trained tactics and then move forward, thinking of de-escalation the whole time. As you go through this, think about opportunities to de-escalate. So anytime you go to a new environment before, maybe that person didn't hear the warning, maybe it's deeper into a building or farther through some very thick woods and brush, stop, give another warning, give that person an opportunity to give up, give that warning so that other people, civilian witnesses, can hear you doing it. It will protect you. And again, remember, we're still trying to generate compliance no matter what happens. Stop, get behind something big enough to stop bullets. If your dog starts giving you proximity indication, everybody thinks, oh, we're getting close and we're going to rush in there. No, we've got an opportunity here. That opportunity means stop, get behind something big enough to stop bullets and call that person out and say, look, you got a chance here. And remind them who you are. That dog's at play. That dog finds the dog could bite them. And they got a chance to not have that happen if they just come out or if they just contact the nearest officer. And also, if you hear sounds of movement, pause, listen, because you get more intelligence about this search process. If you hear that movement, you may get a direction of travel where you can now tell your containment officers, hey, look to your left, look to your right, look east, look west. There's some movement in that direction. Those things are really important for you to consider as you're going through this, because that sound of movement is one more piece of intelligence that other people need to know about. So make sure that whoever is in your search team also is dedicated. I'm the communications officer. I'm the one that's going to do that. Usually that's going to be the commander, or he's going to delegate it to one of his, the team leader, or he'll delegate it to one of his officers. But have somebody whose job it is to get on the radio, because the last thing you want is everybody keying their mic at the same time and nobody's getting through. And remember, as you go through this process, we used to track, and I think Don Slavic will tell you, in the 70s and 80s when I started, we tracked off lead in the Northwest, and it was a dead sprint. We know better now. And we know that superior tactics are done when they're executed in a slow and deliberate way. This is the old Wes Harden thing about how you win a gunfight, and that is take your time quickly. All right. That means you don't have any wasted motion, but you don't rush. Go through this thing with your brain engaged and your head clear as you proceed through this process. Now, that proximity indication that we were talking about should be an automatic cue for you to pause. If that dog gives you a proximity indication, it's not a full-blown report that he's found somebody, but he's starting to sniff around door frames, or you're starting to see the bracket in a building search, or you're on a track and you can see all of a sudden he's shifted from ground to picking his head up and working air currents. That's a good time, again, to go ahead, communicate to your cover officers, hey, dog's giving me something. Everybody finds cover, and then you take that opportunity to de-escalate. And remember, de-escalation involves controlling the scene. First and foremost, why do I say get behind something big enough to stop bullets? Because that's one of the ways that you can go ahead and take control of that scene from a position of relative safety, greater relative safety than being out in the open behind your dog. Get behind cover, and then use time, distance, angles, and shielding to your advantage. Slow things down, make your canine announcement, and rinse and repeat on that announcement as often as necessary to go forward. Once you're satisfied that that person's not coming out or they've moved on and this was just a set pull, then continue on with the search. And if you're lucky, you'll get to the point where that suspect is located. Now, if that suspect is located, first thing you do, if everything's stopped, communicate with the other officers, and again, find cover. Now, located doesn't mean necessarily, but I'm saying that you actually have found him. You have an idea. That person's over there. behind that tree or in that bush, or I see him up there, or my dog has bracketed this and I'm absolutely positive that person is there behind that thing I can't see. Stop, communicate, find cover, just like I did before, stay in your roles, de-escalate to the extent you possibly can. Remember, feasibility is about, does it make sense to try to do this now? Can we get this done? Can we de-escalate? It's not feasible if that person is taking aggressive action against you right now or against another person, putting somebody at risk. All bets are off at that moment, and you're going to have to go ahead and take action, possibly apply force. But when it's feasible, attempt to de-escalate, generate that compliance that you need. And if it's a barricaded suspect, what do you do? Once that person's in a barricade behind walls, it's going to be played out differently. I'm going to say that in my old agency, they said that right then and there, patrol officers, canine officers, wash your hands of that surge and pass it on to SWAT. That's SWAT's job. They handle barricaded subjects. You don't. We do this. Other agencies are going to say, Canine, you're a special operations resource. You're going to stay on this. Patrol officers, you're going to stand fast till SWAT gets here. And then eventually, maybe they're going to tell you to send your dog in. Okay, that's great. Do it with all due deliberation. And realize that when you do this, you have to make a decision about whether you're going to apply that dog as a tool of force or not. And Scott, I'm going to quote Scott Sargent again on this. He said, this is the critical question you have to ask yourself. Would the use of the canine be more or less likely to contribute to successfully controlling the suspect? In other words, is that dog biting that person likely to ramp this up or dial it down? Very often, just realize when that dog's on the bite, things tend to escalate. Things tend to accelerate. Is that what you really want in that moment? You got to make a decision, because if you can generate compliance without getting that, everybody comes out the better. Now, if you're in engagement with a suspect and that suspect's getting the upper hand, different story. If that suspect is putting somebody else at risk, different story. If you have a bunch of officers that are trying to handcuff that guy and they're struggling with him, but he doesn't have the upper hand, probably ought to keep the dog out of it. Canine officers have lost their jobs when they've tried to use the dog as a tool of pain compliance in that circumstance. Not a good idea. And you have to realize something, that when we talk about this use of force analysis, if you make a decision to do this, the only body that is enjoined not to use 20/20 hindsight, Graham versus Connor, remember, it talks about these should be used not with 20/20 hindsight, but by now dealing with the circumstances are tense and rapidly evolving. Only the courts are thus enjoined. Your department policy is not, your department's Office of Professional Accountability or whatever its equivalent is, your IIS, your IA, what do you want, for whatever you want to call them, community groups, they don't care. They're going to use 20/20 hindsight all day long. They will break video down frame by frame and they'll use what's known as decision point analysis. You had this in front of you there. What did you decide? If the decisions you make tend to accelerate instead of decelerate something, they're going to question it and you're going to have to come up with answers. Not saying that the answer is wrong. Sometimes there's a need to do it, but you understand the dog is really not the best pain compliance tool in the world because it's a binary. If I put a gooseneck come along on somebody and I want to get them out from point A to point B and I apply pressure on that wrist and they go open their toes and they go, okay, I'm going to come with you. Guess what? I can lighten up the pressure on that, still maintain control of that arm and essentially reinforce their cooperation by taking the discomfort away. Dog can't do that. They don't modulate the same way. It's a binary. It's on, it's off. There's a lot of pain or the dog is on. And that's not looked favorably on the courts when you think of it as a pain compliance tool. You have to have really extenuating circumstances to have that make sense. Now, if the dog is on the bite, again, we're talking about the Graham factors, and we know that's the severity of the crime, whether the suspect is resisting or fleeing, and whether they pose a threat to officers or others. And understand that most of the courts, most of the circuits right now are putting most of the weight on that last one, whether that person poses a threat to officers or others. The severity of the crime by itself does not justify a bite. Even the homicide suspect doesn't necessarily justify a bite if they're not resisting, they're not fleeing, and they aren't posing a threat to others. So understand this is a balancing act between those three things, and they will put different weight on each of them. But the one most critically examined is whether that person poses a threat to officers or others. Your job is to articulate how that person posed a threat in that moment and understand whether they actually do or not before you decide you're going to apply that dog. Because use of force analysis is shifting to consider necessity and proportionality. In other words, was it mandated by policy, law, or both? Did it have to happen? They're looking at this. They're saying it was just reasonable an officer did it. No, did it have to happen? That's what the necessity piece is. And was it proportional? Did the degree of force fit with the level of resistance offered? And you're going to have to consider some things. Is that suspect still a threat? Are they still armed? Is the environment one in which it's clear for you to move up and take control of that person? Realizing that a verbal out is preferred, but we also know that sometimes you're going to have to do a hands-on out. And if you do that, you're giving up the tactical advantage of being behind something that's big enough to stop bullets to go up there and move forward with that dog to do it. And so some of the reasons for doing that is maybe because of the struggle and proximity to other weapons there. You need to have other officers take control of that person's arms and legs before the dog lets go. Don't waste time. Get it over with quickly. The courts are really hammering the idea of time on bite also. It's not looked on favorably if we leave that dog on there while that person's essentially not giving up, saying, I want to give up now. And even if they don't have their hands split at that point, they're starting to think, you probably ought to think about getting that dog off of them. Do it as quickly and efficiently as you can. And that's where practice with your patrol officers is really a good thing, because some of them probably aren't too comfortable moving forward with that dog's on them. And so if you can help them develop that degree of comfort, life gets better when you're actually having to deploy the dog out in the field. And again, stay in your roles. Resist the urge in that moment to take over and be the team leader. If you have to snap somebody out of it, go ahead and do that. But generally speaking, you're the one that's clear, and you've seen this enough times in training to know what it looks like for a dog to be on bite. They have never been exposed to it. And for the first time, for some of them, it's a bit of a shock and they have to think about it. And once you get this all done, now you got to deal with the post-bite stuff. When that post-bite comes up, the first thing that they're going to want to know that you've done is attend to the suspect injuries. Then they care that we've confirmed other officers' well-being. It's important for us to think about this, and they're all important. I want to take care of my team first and foremost, no doubt about that. Unfortunately, we actually have laws that are being instituted in some states, Washington being one of them, in which they put a priority. They say, you have to do this. They don't say you have to attend to the team's well-being. So we have to comply with that component of the law. As soon as our handlers know that as soon as they got a bite, first thing to do, they tell radio, notify a canine supervisor, and get that canine supervisor on the way. And then you take care of making sure that suspect's injuries are taken care of. You evacuate the suspect from the scene if they need to go for medical treatment. All of those things are done. You have to make a decision about whether you're going to go ahead and continue to search. Because if you continue to search, are you looking for a different suspects, or is there evidence? Or if you were tied up with the use of force, can you still deploy that dog under the use of force? Your policy will clear it up. Our policy says that you're still able to deploy unless the dog had an unjustified and unintended bite. At that point, you're done and you bring in another dog. But if that dog had a justified bite, they can continue to search for a second suspect or evidence or whatever. Again, still trying to generate compliance. It's really important that as you go through this process, once you've got all that done, you debrief. If you don't have debriefs as a part of your culture in your organization, in your canine unit, you probably ought to consider it. After action reports and debriefs are bread and butter for the military, because you get lessons learned from them. You pick up things and you document it. It's really important too, that this documentation, if your department doesn't have a very tightly scripted, clearly defined dog bite investigation process, you need to get ahead of the curve and get one. I would strongly recommend that post-bite process be handled by the canine supervisor who comes in, who does not take over as an incident commander or anything like that. The canine supervisor is another special resource that is there to support canine handler that was employed as a resource in this ICS modeled search. It's really important to realize that as you go through that post-bite investigation, that you get photos of the suspect injuries that they're the most accurate depiction possible. That means clean and unbandaged. So you got to be there just the right time. So sometimes it's good to have either the handler or another officer there get those photos at that moment. Our agency prefers that you do those photos with a single lens reflex digital camera, but every officer has a cell phone. So they'll give someone the cell phone because they can know they can get that before the fire department bandages it up. And maybe the canine supervisor doesn't get there in time to get that. So it doesn't hurt to have more photos than you need as long as they are accurate depictions of a clean and unbandaged wound. You want them clean so that you can actually see the degree of damage. It's not about hiding how bloody it is. It's about actually seeing what the wound looks like. Get recorded statements, either on body worn or ICV or a separate audio recorder. Recorded statements, particularly of witnesses, particularly of suspects, are critical. Particularly of suspects, you get their Miranda warnings, you advise them that they're being recorded, and you get their account and get them to give you the information they need. And in addition to this, you should get written statements from the canine officer, from the cover officers that were part of the search team that witnessed the use of force, and any other witnesses that were there, civilians or officers. Because canine bite investigations come under pretty heavy scrutiny, particularly when they start going up further than that, especially if there's anything out of the ordinary with them. Just the circumstance of it being out of the ordinary, it's going to get looked at. And that's why you want people's memories of this preserved as soon as possible while they're fresh and in a medium that you can get back and look at and you can get the information you need. Recordings and then written. Now, after you're done with all this process, the search is all there. Again, go back to the debrief and debrief your post-bite process too. Did that work? Did it work out the way we want it to? Because as you go through this process, you're going to wind up doing a lot of searches if you're a canine handler. And over time, it will become second nature. And bad habits can pop in. So it's really important to realize that if you get in the habit of managing canine searches with ICS principles, it helps you do a lot of things. Yeah, it takes more work at the beginning of the search. You're going to front load your effort like that. You're going to spend a lot of time telling everybody who's doing what and making sure that they stay on those rules. But if you have that and you have a dedicated cover officer with you, you're going to come out of your searches intact. You're going to come out just like that team I described earlier. They had their rules defined and everything worked well. And remember, your goal is to try and generate complaints whenever possible. Everybody loves to have an exciting canine deployment. But really, in the end, our goal is to get people to comply. And so our mantra through this is reasonable, necessary, and proportional. That's where the use of force is. Remember that just because fortune may favor the bold, the courts and the public favor patience. Now I'm pretty much wrapped up with this. We're going to go ahead and go into a discussion about this right now. There's going to be a follow-up presentation on this, on the higher levels of this and managing bigger high-level searches that are more complex. John Kerwig, Lou Ferman, and Scott Sargent are going to present on that. It's going to be an awesome thing next month. Tell everybody to come back for that. And in the meantime, if you need to get a hold of me, now that I'm no longer at a Seattle.gov email address, you can reach me at steve@proactivecanine.com. And I'm done. Don, if you're ready.
Thanks a lot. Very good. It's hard to follow Steve White. He is truly a Renaissance man and definitely is as familiar with scent as he is with philosophy. So I hope everybody listened to what he had to say. I'm only going to follow up just briefly. I echo a lot of what Steve says. The handler should not get involved in the handcuffing if possible. There may be times where he has to because you're in a crawl space of an attic or something of that nature. The sergeant, however, should not be involved in the handcuffing unless exigent circumstances, because I'm seeing a lot of situations where command and control is brought up in litigation, and the supervisor is supposed to be doing just that, supervising. Why are they getting into the mix and getting involved in the handcuffing and the extraneous struggle when they should be standing back directing resources? So again, if you have sufficient personnel, the sergeants should do their job supervising, not getting involved. Stephen was straight on when he said the length of time in the bite is a critical factor to consider. There's some case law coming out for a period of time now, and everybody's taking a look at how long is the dog on the bite. The initial apprehension may be fine on the Graham versus Connor, but the longer that dog stays in the bite, that can become the excessive part in and of itself. And as we like to say, just because you can doesn't mean you should. Um, I think Steve has talked about this. I'm very concerned about the risk of losing police dogs because of this national discussion that's going on. And we've all seen the videos that are out there from dogs being bad deployments and the dogs not being able to come off the bikes right away. The handler praising their dog on video, which you all understand. The public and the judges don't. So I think we just need to do a better job and not always have to get the bite if we can get the surrender. And I agree that the new terminology as we go forward, I'm already seeing it in California now in some stipulated judgments between our state attorney general and some police departments that are engaged in these stipulated judgment with our state attorney general's office are using the words proportionality and necessity. It is becoming part of law enforcement lexicon, and we need to be careful about that going forward. That's about all I have to say. But the ICS system is so important. I'm handling a lot of protest cases for some jurisdictions out here in California. And in a lot of the after action reports for a lot of departments nationwide, ICS is one of the most talked about parts of those operations. So it is a huge factor in law enforcement. People are going to be asking about it. So well done, Steve. I'm looking forward to next month as well. So thank you, Don.
Gene, one question to you, back at you. Can you mention the ramifications of the word necessary in your policy?
Yeah. I know in California right now, there's a debate going on. When we amended the penal code section that deals with use of force, 835A, about 2 years ago now, the ACLU has argued because the word necessary is now in there that we have a necessary standard. We can't satisfy a necessary standard because it's an unattainable perfect standard. Uh, I believe it's still reasonable. And so I think 98% of the population agrees because our statute quotes directly out of Graham versus Connor. And so I'm always going to argue reasonableness. But once you start getting to necessity, they're going to say, no, it wasn't necessary for you to use the dog. It turns out the suspect wasn't armed. It wasn't necessary to shoot him because he was armed with a bar of soap. That bar of soap could not have harmed you. So therefore, it wasn't necessary nor proportional to have used deadly force on that person. Whereas under the reasonable standard, you had every reason to believe that bar of soap looked like a gun. The suspect acted as if he had a gun, and you believed reasonably that your life and the lives of other and nearby was an imminent danger of death or great bodily injury. So I'm scared we're going to lose that reasonableness argument, and it's going to go to necessity, proportionality, which is going to be a higher standard than Graham. And we're seeing that being pushed throughout the country in Maryland, New Jersey, elsewhere. Don't help our state legislators get there by not using the dogs properly.
Thanks, Gene. I appreciate it. I have one more question for Steve or John or Gene or Dave or Lou. What are the possible consequences of using officer safety always instead of giving a warning? Is there any? Anybody?
I'm a huge proponent in warnings. In all the cases that I've tried, both on the canine side and on the SWAT side, giving warnings, it can't hurt you. It can only help you. And then those become our witnesses saying, my God, that the police department gave warnings for 20 minutes. I couldn't sleep. That's witness number one I want out there. We're not stealth ninjas. We've got to give warnings in order to comply with the Fourth Amendment. Again, there's cases all over the country talking about that. It isn't rocket science.
I'm actually referring, and that was great. I like the answer. I was actually referring to a portion of Steve's lecture where he talked about the dog giving some type of indication absent an actual full out, yeah, he's over there. Is that the time that you pick a place of cover and give an announcement? Is what was thinking of.
I'm going to chime in and say, yeah, that's exactly what I intended. That as you move through the search environment, there will be different environmental cues that should trigger further canine announcements. One is going to a place where somebody probably couldn't hear it. Another one's going to be a proximity indication. Another one's going to be where the dog maybe is working something a little harder. That might be time for you to pause. If nothing else, you pause and you try and assess why the dog is giving you that information. And as long as you pause, what does it hurt to give a warning? Ask yourself, what do I lose? Maybe 30 seconds. And if you've got good containment, that 30-second works in your favor.
Thank you. John or Lou?
Hi, everybody. John Kerwick here. Steve, thanks for a great presentation as always. And I just wanted to highlight one of the things you already covered, but I think it's important enough to do it. We're addressing everybody across the nation with this webinar. So our levels of training for our specialized units in Canine and for patrol are varied beyond belief. Some have some excellent training, and some can form up a search team right away, and some have no clue what you're talking about when you get there. And I've experienced both sides of that. That's why I just want to just reinforce the containment part. I was one of those old guys too, who was trained initially to just get your dog out of the car and start on the track. And those three, they're gone. And I really hope that people aren't alluding to that anymore during their training. But the only way that we can actually train properly when we first get to a scene with that dog is to have containment. There, when we get there, we got to, it's so important. Otherwise, we're going to have to wait for our guards. We're going to have to wait for our wing people and some of our cover officers to set up and have these debriefings before we go out there. If we don't do that today, bad things happen to us, and it's going to end up in a result of a bad day. I'll just leave it there. Now is just slow everything down and just do what we're supposed to do. It's so important. And Steve, you covered it, but I just felt it was worth mentioning that it's hard to untrain sometimes. And we were actually trained to, when we got to a scene, to get out of the car with your canine on lead to walk up and get the information. And I don't know whether I would be the person to say that it's a good idea these days. Containment is everything. Thanks.
I look.
All right. Thank you very much. So I wrote a few notes here. I'd like to underscore a couple things. And I come from this at a different perspective. I'm here in New Hampshire and I see Alex is here too. So listen, we share our resources quite a bit up here. And there's many instances where dogs are deployed into other jurisdictions to help out a neighboring agency. So I want to cover those points and underscore some of the things that Steve talked about that pertain to that. But I want to start by saying that what he talks about isn't just for person searches. This can be for the explosive detection dog going into another jurisdiction. It can be for a search and rescue type operation. This covers not just the felonious type of search, but all kinds of searches where you might be deploying your dog in an incident command type of situation. The most important thing is I want to underscore the importance of the cover officers that you're going with. And I often tell this story of how I was once called to a neighboring agency to go search for a dangerous person. And my cover officer, upon starting, took out his pipe and started smoking a pipe like we were going out for an English fox hunt. And okay, so that's a problem, no doubt. Covering the cover officer, the importance of that, I wanted to underscore and start with that. But other things that come in with other jurisdictions is their level of training. Do they have similar tactics? What's going to be their reaction upon you coming across somebody? It may be their very first felonious type of arrest with some of these smaller agencies. You have various levels of training, various levels of experience. You have different policy considerations. They may be operating under different policy than you. I always like to bring my own cover officers from my agency just so I knew that I had one or two similar backup officers to what I was going to do. And hopefully those backup officers that I was bringing from my agency were also experienced with working with me and the dog at the same time. So we had that kind of a first response team going into the area. But then you had the familiarity with the area. So I can't remember how many times I was in the woods and I had really no idea where the heck I was going. We come across a street. I don't know what street I was on, and trying to give directions like that. But I want to talk administratively too about what gets included in the other officers' reports from other agencies. Now, they may not be trained to just include in their report that the dog was deployed and then leave to you to talk about the dog's actions and behavioral changes and things like that. So you may get an officer in another jurisdiction that is really freelancing your dog's actions, that the dog was not even on scent at certain times, and just narrating their imminent approach towards you working the dog. So you need to make sure what gets included in their report is not going to be conflictory with your professional analysis of how the dog was reacting in there. Other things you got to worry about is who's collecting evidence along the way. What do we do with that footprint that you're finding that might be very valuable? Who's going to be picking up that gun or whatever? And what happens to those type of things? And then lastly, I'm going to leave with this, and this is the internal report or the internal investigation that occurs from your deployment of the dog that another agency is doing. And that is why Steve mentioning the debrief is so very important, because you have to have a debrief of your call where you are deploying your dog in another jurisdiction. And guys, it is so that you can write down in your notebook the comments that the other officers have made immediately upon your call. Because don't be surprised if when the crap hits the fan and 2 weeks later, all kinds of attention is placed upon this call. And now all those other officers, they have a different recollection of what they have that night. And they're now throwing you under the bus for your action. And that's why it's important that when you have your debrief, you write down a couple of the notes and say, Officer X said, yeah, thank God your dog was there. It was very important that your dog was deployed that way, or something like that, so that they can't later change their words because the heat is now on them. So you need to make sure that you're protecting yourself. You need to make sure that you are writing an accurate report as to what happened and how the dog was reacting. And most importantly, I think that we need to pay attention that the canine handler is not the incident commander, but actually is a tool that is being used at that incident. So that's all I have, Don. Thank you very much. Steve, that was a powerful presentation. And thank you for everybody else for being here.
Steve, I got the impression, and it was well given, that we no longer need to be the tip of the spear. We need to be using our dogs as a locating tool with the possibility of having to do something such as that. But now we have cover officers and things like that to help us out. And I appreciate everything you said. Thank you, everybody. Have a good day. Be safe.